Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. I think this, yeah. Good afternoon. Well, welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad that you are full of talk and chatter, but now you have to do some listening and then some deciding, and it's a very participatory event. Anyway, we're thrilled to have you. I'm here to introduce the introducer, but before that, I will remind you of that Trudy Rubin is coming up next for the lunches, and also you won't want to miss our collaborative program with the medical college. Here's a doctor who is professor and founding chair of the Department of Humanities, Health, and Society at the Florida International University. He has a lot at their School of Medicine. So he has a lot to say about not medicine as medicine, but medicine as a profession, a service, and the title of his talk is Lessons from Our Most Vulnerable Patients, Why We Should Treat Without Prejudice. So I think it's going to be something very special. But now let me introduce Matt Meyer, Associate Professor of Philosophy, a friend and colleague, to introduce the speaker.
So thank you, Sandra. I have the good fortune and distinct honor to introduce Morey M, our speaker. Over the past few years, I've had the good fortune of coming to know Morey through my work with his wife, Sandra. In that time, I've come to respect Morey so much that I tend to think of him as what I will call my ideal doppelganger. No, he's not my doppelganger because of the last name. This is because he spells it wrong. He goes by M-Y-E-R-S. I still can't figure out the reason for the plural. Anyway, the right spelling is M-E-Y-E-R, which is how I spell my last name. So it's not the name. Instead, there is another reason why he's my ideal doppelganger. By doppelganger, I mean, of course, a second or alternative version of myself and my life. And he's my ideal doppelganger because he has lived the sort of life and had the kind of legal career that I had once contemplated but opted not to pursue. In other words, I wanted to go to law school. Specifically, the kind of legal career that Morey has pursued is one that employs legal education and expertise to serve and promote the public good. After serving in the Army and going to what would have been my safety school, Yale Law, it's a joke. Well, Morey, was there a year at Penn? We don't like to talk about that? Okay. He began his legal career as a litigator in criminal cases. In the mid-'60s, he made what Saunders tells me was a transformational decision to go to the South during the Civil Rights Movement, doing nothing less than desegregating courtrooms. His work for the public good continued as Assistant Attorney General of Pennsylvania and General Counsel to former Governor Casey. After working for Philadelphia law firms, he then formed his own, Myers, Brier Kelly, here in Scranton. Despite a busy schedule, he has nevertheless found time to work with nonprofits such as the United Way and Jewish charities, and to teach at prestigious institutions like Yale, Rutgers, Hamilton, and our own University of Scranton, which recently bestowed upon him an honorary degree. Thus, his legal career has been nothing short of ideal, and this is why I would have been thrilled if my second self had achieved only a portion of what Morey has accomplished. It's true. And his energy does not stop. Today we will have the pleasure of hearing Morey speak on the topic, who was the greater American, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln? Although I know this is a favorite topic of Morey's, sometimes he'll just ask me out of the blue, Matt, who was the greatest president? I have to admit that my generation often had other topics on our mind. For when we wanted to know who was greater, we typically asked Magic or Bird, Michael or Madonna, Gates or Jobs. However, I also have to admit that debates about athletes, entertainers, and entrepreneurs are somewhat superficial in comparison to Morey's subject. It is perhaps paradoxical that the success of political figures such as Washington and Lincoln have provided future generations with the luxury of discussing more trivial matters. Lest we remain superficial, we therefore ought to pause with Morey to reflect on his question, for so doing will help us focus our attention on what it means to be an exemplary public servant. For contrary to what the recent History Channel, I have to put this dig in there, the History Channel documentary, The Men Who Built America, implies, it is not the Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans who built America, but I maintain it was the wisdom, courage, and prudence of great political figures like Washington and Lincoln who built an America that in turn allowed industry, entertainment, and athletics to flourish. So let us lend Morey our ear and join me in giving him a hand as we welcome his thoughts on this important topic.
Thank you, Matt, for that excessively exaggerated introduction. And let me tell you just a little bit about Matt. He's one of the most respected members of the faculty here, and he volunteers as the advisor to the Pre-Law Society. And I think it's safe to say he's the only faculty member at this university who has 2 PhDs, one from the University of Vienna and one from Boston University. Having said that, I find the only blemish in recognizing him is he doesn't have an S on the end of his name. Here we are first of all, you have to ask, why am I here? Well, let me tell you why I'm here. Recently, a distinguished professor at the Commonwealth Medical College was lecturing to a group of students, and he asked them, what would you do in this situation? A grandfather is with his 2.5-year-old toddler grandson, and suddenly he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a bunch of coins, gives them to his grandson. And the grandson immediately takes those coins and swallows them. Now he asks the students, what do you do? Well, one student said, I'd grab the young child by the rear and see if I could compress it to expel the coins. The second one said, no, what I would do is I'd stick my finger down his throat to see if I could disgorge it. And the third student said, I'd go right to the emergency room, they know better. No, 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 said the professor. What you do is you call Sandra Myers. She can get money out of anybody. So that's why I'm here. I want to recognize our distinguished President Judge Tom Munley, great servant both to this community and, of course, at Vietnam. Thanks, Judge Munley, for coming. And I want you to know that he's assured me that however we vote on this troublesome decision, he will not recognize any appeal. So let's first take a vote. Who is the greater, Washington? Lincoln. Oh, I got a tough assignment here. Dealing with the absurdities of who is a greater American. Men living at different times with different challenges and circumstances, different approaches to life. And then you have the question of great. Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s said, the direction of a country is determined by the biography of their men, saying great men made great countries. And Herbert Spencer came along a generation later and said, not so. Not so, that circumstances determine that. So that historians, when they're determining and evaluating the greatest presidents, they usually say 3. George Washington, because he dealt with the problem of getting this country going. It had no prospects of getting started, and he put it together. Abraham Lincoln, who had a equally serious challenge of preserving the country. And, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had the two crises of the Depression and the war. The question of greatness is, when I say greater American, I don't think, although people have evaluated Washington and Lincoln as presidents, I have never seen any evaluation of the totality of their lives. And so we want to look at, in a comprehensive sense, we can only go backwards because, tragically, of course, Abraham Lincoln only lived into the second month of his second term when he was assassinated, and George Washington only lived for a couple of years after he left the presidency. So, George Washington, identified as a man with silver buckles on his pump shoes and silk stockings and military garb, erect, taciturn, and a great dancer. Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin, one room, coonskin cap, ungainly body, clothes that didn't seem to belong on him, although you know where he got his clothes when he was the president? From Brooks Brothers. He was folksy, loved people, and as far as dancing, when he was courting his wife-to-be, Mary Todd, he said, "I want to dance with you in the worst way." And after the dance, Mary Todd said, "And you did." What was common about them? They were both tall men. Washington was 6'2", 6'3". Lincoln was 6'4". Both were very strong men, strong physically. It was suggested that Abraham Lincoln could put his axe into a log and embed it deeper than anybody. They were both surveyors by training. Both, it may surprise you, had limited formal education. We know about Lincoln only having 1 year formal education, but Washington, when he was 11 years old, he was homeschooled. His father died, and that effectively ended his education. So he had no formal education either. But they were both super patriots. So let's take a look at George Washington. At the age of 21, he was recruited by the British to become involved in negotiating with the French on what was to become the French and Indian War. And he was made a major in the militia provisional army, not the British army. And he became quite well known. And then when the French and Indian War started, he was involved in it in a very courageous way. It was suggested that on at least 4 occasions he had bullets that entered his coat but didn't penetrate into his body. And twice he had horses shot out from underneath him. He applied for a commission in the British Army as a major and was turned down. Now, can you imagine where we'd be today if George Washington had a military career with the British? He returned to Virginia, leaving while the war was still on, to be elected to the House of Burgesses. That is the legislative body that, in conjunction with the governor of Virginia, governor appointed by the king, determined the local affairs and he served in that for about 17 years. When the French and Indian War ended, it went on for 6 or 7 years, the British said, wait a minute, we fought this war for the colonists. They were the total beneficiaries of it. their country, at least their geography, has such potential. We in England are so squeezed. Why don't we make them pay for it? Which made some sense. And so they enacted the Stamp Tax Act in 1765. That taxed all legal documents, trusts, wills, deeds, contracts, court proceedings, periodicals, newspapers, magazines, journals, playing cards, dice, and the colonists said no. Washington took a position strong against the tax, but at that time was not advocating secession, not advocating revolution. The tax became so oppressive to the British merchants that they called on Parliament to rescind it, and it never went into effect. But that was his first venture into expressive political activity. In 1774, the colonists said, somehow this isn't working. What they really were asking for, contrary to most revolutionaries, was, we want to get in, we want to participate, we don't want out, we want in. And again, the British foolishly did not give them any kind of role in terms of participation in parliamentary decisions. So they called a conference in Philadelphia. It met only for 6 weeks, and then agreed that it would meet the following May of 1775, again in Philadelphia, to make further decisions. By that time that conference was called, a war was on. Concord and Lexington had taken place. Bunker Hill was about to take place, and it was clear that there was going to be an extensive military effort. Washington came to that second Congress in full military garb. And it is suggested that the president of the Congress, John Hancock, said, well, we have the issue, the most important issue, of a military commander for all of the colonies. And they said, fine, Mr. President, who do you suggest? He said, I suggest John Hancock. And John Adams said, whoa, wait a minute. We need someone with some military experience and someone who makes it clear that this is not just a war between Massachusetts and the Crown, or even New England and England, but of all of the colonies. And therefore, George Washington. He was acclaimed. He said, I will take the job on one condition. I receive no salary for it. He fully expected that, and he so wrote his wife Martha, with whom he had a very close relationship, and she was with him all the way during the war, often coming to the front to be with him for long periods of time. He wrote to her and said that I expect to be back in 6 months. Well, the war went on for 8.5 years. Now, Washington was not a great, or historians say, and I'm not a military historian by any means, was not a great military strategist. But what he was he was a great inspiration to his troops. There he was in the front all the time, never quitting, breaking the British will, fighting the most powerful military force in the history of the world at that point, and ultimately prevailing. He developed a close relationship with a young Frenchman, Lafayette. And Lafayette, as the war was going along, said, what we ought to do is move our troops from New York down to Virginia and do battle there. And they did. And in 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, with the assistance of many thousands of French troops, Washington prevailed, and effectively the war was over, although it didn't end officially for another 1.5 years. When it came to 1783, and it was clear that it was now over, and that Washington was giving every indication that he was going back to his beloved Mount Vernon to take up farming, and people said, well, he could be anything. He could be king, emperor, whatever. And King George III, when he heard that Washington was considering going home to Mount Vernon, said, if he does that, he's the greatest man on the face of the earth. And he did that. So in 1783, Washington goes back to Mount Vernon, but he has a relationship with another young protege, someone who's living some miles down the road, James Madison. And Madison is keeping him informed on progress of this new nation, which had adopted the Articles of Confederation, which, as we all know, had some benefits but considerable flaws. It had no executive, it had no judiciary, it had no capacity to tax, and it was clear the country couldn't survive with that kind of a controlling document. So as he would meet regularly with Madison, Madison would keep him informed. Madison told him a few years later, we have to do something. And what we have to do is we have to have a new kind of government, new structure. And I'm going to assemble a conference in Philadelphia to invite all the then states to come. That was in 1787, and Virginia, all the states, were to designate their delegates by the state legislatures, and there's Washington's name is listed as the lead delegate. He didn't advocate it. He wasn't aware of it. He didn't want it. He was planning not to go. And so the great decision was, does Washington go to that convention or doesn't he? I don't know. What's Joe Biden going to do? Same kind of thing. Now, he had, on one hand, he had supporters and admirers on both sides. One side said, do not do this. This convention is doomed. You will blemish your worldwide reputation. On the other hand, he had his supporters who said, you must do this. Otherwise, it is doomed. There is no other national figure. After all, at that time, there were only two national figures in the states, Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was old and sick, and they pushed him, and he was up in the air. And he said, there's another reason why I can't go. It's called, I am the president of the Society of Cincinnati. The Society of Cincinnati was formed after the war, named after Lucius Cincinnatus, a Roman figure who left his farm, went to Rome to solve all the problems of Rome, and when he did, he went back to his farm. So the Society of Cincinnati, which Washington was the president, he said, I'm not running again, his term was up, and I'm not going to your conference, which was in Philadelphia a week before this Constitutional Convention was meeting. He said, how can I not go to this group that I'm very much attached to and go a week later to another group? Anyway, it was resolved, and he did go, of course, and he was elected president of the conference. Now, he takes a bad rap for his participation at the conference because it said he didn't speak at all. Well, he didn't speak at all because that was his job. He was not to direct anybody. But he was a huge influence on the deliberations. For example, the issue came up, the presidency. Is the presidency to be one person or a committee, like our county commissioners here? It was a serious debate, except everyone knew who was going to be the president. And they said, we can't be that disrespectful. We have to abandon any thought of some kind of consensus group. It is going to be George Washington. When the states finally ratified the Constitution, and that's another subject of full discussion some other date, and he went, he had no custom, no tradition, no precedent, nothing to guide him by. And he had to pick a cabinet, he had to have a currency, he had to develop a mint, he had to have a budget, he had to create a Coast Guard, and he proved himself to be an extraordinary administrator. After 2 years in the office, he said, I'm finished. I want to go back to my beloved Mount Vernon. By the way, Mount Vernon was not just a farm, it was 9,000 acres, 5 separate farms. He was a masterful farmer and administrator of that complex. He had more slaves on his farm than there were in the national government at the time. Well, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, 2 men who agreed on nothing except Washington, prevailed on him, you got to finish the term. After the first term, it started again, and they said, no, you've got to go on. He had been elected unanimously in the Electoral College on the first term. The second term came up, he's elected unanimously again. 100% of the Electoral College voted for George Washington on 2 occasions. During his second term, he ran into a conflict called the Whiskey Tax Rebellion. That was a group of farmers in western Pennsylvania who found that they couldn't move their grain east, so they distilled it into whiskey, and there was a very modest tax on it. They organized thousands of people, and it was a rebellion. Washington said, supremacy of the federal law, there's a tax, it must be honored. He got on his horse and led troops through western Pennsylvania and backed down the rebellion. When it came time for him to leave, he decided that he would have an address to the people of the United States, not to the states, not to the Congress, but to the people. And his farewell address is very well known. I believe it was read in the Congress, House of Representatives until some years ago, and still is read every Washington's birthday in the United States Senate in full. A couple of components of it, he said. No alignments with England, no alignments with France. We remain neutral, and it's often called no entangling alliances. Now, actually, he didn't say that in his address. Thomas Jefferson did in his inaugural some years later. The second thing that he said was a strong central government. This was contrary to the position of many of the leaders at the time. As a matter of fact, historians debate how would Thomas Jefferson and George Washington react during the Civil War. And historians generally conclude that Jefferson would have gone with the Confederacy. He had often referenced my country, Virginia, and Washington would have remained with the Union. The third thing that Washington did was no third term, no monarchy. No man is indispensable. What is indispensable is the government, and the people who operate it are dispensable. And he stepped out. He was called on by John Adams to, when there was some potential of a conflict, military conflict with France, and he gathered himself up again and led troops, but nothing happened. Abraham Lincoln, born in Kentucky, a slave state. Moved to Indiana, not a slave state, but racially hostile, at the age of 7. Moved when he was 21 years old to Central Illinois, also hostile. What did he do? Well, he worked in a store. He bought a store, but it didn't succeed. But then he was elected to the state legislature. 4 times he was elected. Didn't have a particularly distinguished career in there. About all that could be referenced historically was that when the legislature wanted to condemn the abolitionists, he and one other member of the legislature opposed that, although he wasn't an abolitionist, and I can discuss that with you in a few minutes. Then he got his law license. He studied on his own, became a successful lawyer, and then in his middle 30s, ran for Congress. 1 term. Why 1 term? He was a member of the Whig Party. The Whig Party had no political strength in Illinois except this little pocket where Lincoln lived, and the decision was made to spread it around, let everybody have 1 term so we could have more people in Congress. He went home and practiced law, and he was quite successful. In 1854, Stephen Douglas, probably the most famous political figure in Illinois and maybe in the United States, enacted what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Law, which said that slavery should be decided in those territories by, quote, popular sovereignty. That was his position, popular sovereignty. I see Mary Rhodes, the expert on Northwest Ordinance, and Lincoln said, no go, that isn't right. That isn't right because of many reasons, including the whole morality of it. That got Lincoln going in some public way on his now well-known historical positions. In 1858, he's nominated for the United States Senate by the then Republican Party. The Whigs had gone out and the Republicans came in. And somehow, and it's not really known why, Stephen Douglas agreed to a series of 7 debates with Abraham Lincoln. These debates took place in small towns in Illinois. Now, if a town had 10,000 people, 20,000 people showed up for the debates. And the debates had the pattern of 1 hour for the first speaker, 1.5 hours for the answering speaker, and a half an hour for the reply. Nobody left. In these debates, the journalists from the Chicago papers came down to these small towns, took extensive notes, went back on the train immediately and transcribed by telegraph into New York, and the debates became nationally known. Stephen Douglas made Abraham Lincoln. He didn't win. He won the popular vote, but as all of you know, this gerrymandering and the decision by the state legislators then selected senators, he lost. But in 1860, Lincoln is invited by Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was the person who said, "Go west, young man." And he invited him to give a speech at Cooper Institute in New York, now known as Cooper Union, a very preeminent engineering school, where it was up until recently absolutely tuition-free, and possibly selective school for student admissions. He did extensive work on that, and he dealt with the issue of slavery, and again, he got enormous national attention. He's the nominee for president, and he's running against 3 other candidates, 3 Democrats against him. John Breckinridge, the Vice President of the United States from Kentucky, John Bell, the United States Senator from Tennessee, and Stephen Douglas, United States Senator from Illinois. Lincoln gets 39% of the vote. But because of the split in the electoral vote, he wins. Now here's Abraham Lincoln elected with the absolute first commitment to preservation of the Union, and within weeks after he does that, South Carolina secedes. The very thing that he was committed to preserve as a result of this election happens against him. And within, before he becomes the president, he's, which was then in March, by constitutional amendment it moved up to January, but then in March, 6 other states secede. So he goes in and he's now got 7 states out of the Union. And he's got a huge balancing act as he wants to preserve the border states, the states particularly of Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. He says, I can't win a war if I don't have those states. And he also, he does not want to be the first one to fire, to be the first mover in this war. So he, a master strategist, he is able to cajole the Confederacy into firing on Fort Sumter. And the war is on. And Lincoln understood that his generals were not so good, so he became really the strategist for the war effort. Now, who was he up against? He was up against the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, who had been a West Point graduate and Secretary of War, and skilled in war efforts. The war isn't going so well. But the next year, in 1862, Lincoln gathers his cabinet together and says, I'm going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And the cabinet is nervous with that box, but supports him. And William Seward says, that's fine, but wait until there's a military victory. We don't want to do it from weakness. We want to do it from strength. Lincoln agrees to that. Then in August of 1862, Lincoln calls together at the White House 5 African-American leaders. He does not include Frederick Douglass. And to the surprise of everyone, he lectures them. And he says essentially, the races cannot exist together in this country. I'm for elimination of slavery, but there should be what's called colonization. Move all those who are freed from slavery and all African Americans in this country somewhere else. First he tried Liberia. He sent several hundred people over there and that failed. Then he talked about Haiti and he engaged somebody to explore that. That didn't work out. And then he talked about Panama. None of those. Colonization, extreme, almost irrational approach. A week later, after this meeting with the 5 African-American leaders who were stunned with what transpired, Horace Greeley, the guy who got him to court and still the publisher of the New York Herald, the most influential newspaper in America, wrote an open letter and said, why aren't you doing more in freeing the slaves? You have legislation, there was so-called confiscation acts, there was apparatus to do it. Lincoln answered him within 2 days, and he said as follows. He said, if I could save the Union and free all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union and have the entire nation slavery, I would do it. And if I could save the nation and have it half slave and half free, I would do it. He said, to me, the Constitution comes first, and the Constitution trumps everything. So he's sitting there with this Emancipation Proclamation, and in September, there is a victory at Antietam in Maryland, a victory that said, okay, now I can issue it. So he issues a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that says within 100 days, I will free all the slaves in the territories that have seceded unless you come back in the Union. He excluded specifically the states that remained loyal that were slave states. Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. They could continue with their slavery. He fully expected and believed that the states that had seceded would come back. But nobody blinked. So on January 1st of 1863, he enacts his Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in those areas that were still at war with the Union. And furthermore, he said, I will give considerable attention to permitting those who are freed to serve in the Union Army. That was a big concession. He had resisted that for some time. Now people say, wait a minute, all this business, this Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't free a single slave. Slavery continued in the 4 states that remained loyal to the Union, and where he said, I free slaves in the Confederacy, they paid no attention to him. So they said, there's a lot of poppycock. That's not true. What it did is, first of all, it gave considerable drive to slaves in the Confederacy to take action, escape, come north, and now they have the prospect of being able to join the Army. But of equal importance was, it appeared that England, and to some extent France, were going to go and support the Confederacy because they were extensively in the textile industry. And France had 200,000 people in it. England had over 1 million textile employees. Now, this stopped them. How could they join a group where the president had said, I freed all the slaves? And that was a popular support with the working people in both England and France. Lincoln was running for his second term, and there was no prospect of his being elected. He was a sure loser. He said, I'm a loser. He called together his cabinet, and he said, I have a sealed envelope here. I have in there a message. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want you to, on your sign on the cover, approval of it. And they did it. When that was opened, when he was reelected, Sherman took Atlanta, and the course of the war took a different direction, and he was elected in a landslide. In that paper, it said that he did not believe that he was going to be reelected. He did not believe that the person who was going to be elected would have the capacity to do what he wanted to do, so he was asking all of his cabinet members to make every final effort to accomplish the objectives of the war. Finally, in 1865, early part, many of you people have seen the film Lincoln, which is pretty accurate. It's pretty good, where he made the effort to accomplish the 13th Amendment, which was, of course, abolition of slavery. Okay, now just a word about the blemishes of these two great heroes. And where do we get to the blemishes? We get to the blemishes on the issue of slavery and race. George Washington, a slaveholder, over 100 slaves that he owned. His wife owned over 200 that she had inherited from her deceased husband, sizable amount. He treated them okay. I mean, the records are that he didn't overfeed them or overclothe them, but okay. But when they escaped, he made every effort to recapture them. After the Battle of Yorktown, where 17 slaves from Washington had escaped, they recaptured 2. He brought them right back into slavery. And when he was the president, and one of his wife's servants escaped, was found in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, he made every effort unsuccessfully to bring back that woman. Furthermore, when he was president, meetings where the capital was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania had enacted a rule that if a slave is brought into Pennsylvania and is here for 6 months, he or she is free. Washington maneuvered that so that his slaves from the capital in Philadelphia would go back to Mount Vernon short of 6 months, and he'd bring in a new group. However, his will, when he died, he left a will which said, "I free all my slaves on the death of my wife." Why did he do that? He explained in his will why. He said there are relationships, there are marital relationships, although marriage wasn't recognized, there were relationships. And he said, if I free some of my slaves, it may disrupt that relationship. There'll be one person who'll be married, who will be free, and another person who won't be free. Right? He did that to exercise maximum pressure on his wife to free her slaves. He also said, I want those slaves that are freed to be, if they're elderly and infirmed, to be provided for. And the young people, this is startling, I want them to receive an education and have them trained for a meaningful vocation. In fact, his wife, who was very nervous about being killed, because the pressure was when she dies, she freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln. On slavery, he was consistent. He was opposed to slavery. Why? He never talked about the brutality of it. He never talked about the disruptive of it. He had a simple approach that every person is entitled to his or her fruits of the labor. However, by any standards of today, or even of that time, Abraham Lincoln was a racist. When he debated with Stephen Douglas in 1858, for example, he said the same throughout all 7, but in Charleston, in his 4th debate, he said, I do not believe that Negroes should have the right to vote. I do not believe they should serve on juries. I do not believe they should be in public office. I do not believe in interracial marriage. And if people present the notion that there is a superior and inferior race, I say the superior race is the white race. And he talked about this crazy notion of colonization in the 2 years in his presidency. We're still talking about it. However, he evolved. And he evolved, and his Emancipation Proclamation and his 13th Amendment reformulated the direction of his country. And one thing Lincoln always did, he went back not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence. 7 years ago, is back to the Declaration of Independence. So there you have two men who were giants. Our country and all of us sitting here are very fortunate that they were where they were at the time that they were there. They were men that were super patriots and super believers in a strong central government. So now the question is, who was the greater? May I hear from you? Drew.
When you consider the times in which they lived, I call it a time.
Coward? Coward or genius? Yeah. Yeah.
I prefer Jesus.
Okay, right. Okay. Right. Barbara? You have? Okay. Any?
Do you want to take a vote?
Take a vote? Washington? Yeah, pick Lincoln? Looks like Lincoln. Okay, any questions? Donald? Donald,
I
yeah?
guess just some observations. Washington did not sign the Declaration of Independence, correct?
No, yeah,
For whatever reason.
yeah.
But I guess I choose Lincoln for other reasons. I guess I'm looking at ramifications to this time, to 2015. I guess one of the things I admired about Lincoln is that he was smart enough, or however, whatever term you want to use, to enlist the Union Army Balloon Corps. Yes, most of you know about that.
Yeah.
Well, he did. Hot air balloons. I think the man's name was Thaddeus Lowe that presented the idea to Lincoln, and he did it in an unusual way. He linked up some sort of telegraph line to the White House, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, he asked if Lincoln would incorporate this Union Army Balloon Corps, and Lincoln said yes. And as a result of that, much information was brought to the government. Aerial intelligence, you might say, because I think, as I pull some of this back, as I'm sure some of you are pulling it back too, this Thaddeus Lowe had over 3,000 or 5,000 ascents, and brought back some great information because the balloon, and I've never flown it and never would go into a hot air balloon, but I think it's 500 feet in the air, and you know, if it's a clear day, you can see for 3 miles. And one of the big concerns was that the Confederacy would attack Washington, D.C., and you know, I think they did not, because he did this. And so, if you look at aerial intelligence and the ramifications for today, in the news are drones, and I don't know how that'll affect that.
Okay.
But anyway, the other thing, how about aircraft, maybe the first aircraft carrier, because he would enlist these, this Thaddeus Lowe would enlist these barges on the Potomac. And
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah, let me not answer that directly, but let me tell you about Lincoln's shortcomings with the military. Lincoln resisted entry of black troops, and particularly those from the South, into the military until people said this was imperative. We need those men to do this, and over 200,000, 10% of the Union forces were that. He also had trouble with equal pay, and finally was prevailed upon to do that. Now, as I said, the interesting thing of Lincoln is he came from positions of resistance to positions of acceptance, so that was the evolution. 3 days before he died, he gave a speech in which he said that the vote should be given to those, talking about African Americans, to those who served in the military or those who were very intelligent, which was interpreted to mean could read and write. So he's still resistant, even at the end, to this notion of really equality. So he has his flaws. Yeah. 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 Richard.
Morey, in an attempt to understand today, and 7 years ago, when Rick Perry was governor of Texas, there was his statement about secession.
About
Secession.
yeah.
Given the circumstances, maybe we should secede. And immediately people thought of the 1850s and the lead up to the Civil War. Well, I read a lot about this period and know that even in 1831, Andrew Jackson had to put a smackdown on John C. Calhoun because he was not any longer a nationalist. He was a states' rights advocate, and he was advocating nullification, interposition. And then I got a couple of books that go all the way back to 1776 to say that was an issue then at the founding of our country and Thomas Jefferson and writing of the Declaration.
Let me say this, Richard. George Washington is applauded and acclaimed for leading the colonies in the secessionist movement. Abraham Lincoln is applauded and acclaimed for denying that. Now, when the states, South Carolina was the first state, its statement of secession, if you read it, it runs quite parallel to the Declaration of Independence. So you are correct that at different times we react in different ways. Yeah.
Thanks for your perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you talked about their flaws in terms of equality, but you haven't mentioned anything about women, and you even started your conversation about the important men in our country. So where were they on women's issues, particularly Lincoln, because the women's voting rights group starts in 18. When the 13th Amendment was proposed, the women's movement in this country said, we will defer. We will first seek the accomplishment of this, and it took more than 50 years after that to get the 19th Amendment. But the women, in terms of that particular political effort, said it's more important to accomplish the first mission of eliminating slavery. And that carried over to the 15th Amendment, when the women said all it took on the 15th Amendment was, in addition to saying race, if you just put 2 more words in, or gender, it would have applied. And the women movement said, we understand the political uncertainties of it, we will defer, and we will carry on from there. So I'm not, it's... See, that's a flaw.
Okay, so it's a flaw, so it's a flaw.
So I think we need to be
Yeah.
clear that when you're looking at who the people of the United States are, we were ignoring half of them.
Well, it's a flaw in lots of people at the time too. I mean, where are the gay spokesmen here? I mean, it isn't a case of just women were deprived. Women made the active choice during the early 1860s, political choice, to postpone advocacy of their effort until after the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were enacted. Yeah, Roe.
Mark, you've given us a sum of their accomplishments. What about a minus? Where would the United States be if George Washington hadn't been there? Where would the United States be if Lincoln hadn't been there? What kind of a country would have been created without Washington?
You can answer that as an Australian. We'd have been where you are. Where are you?
Well, the other end of the universe.
Yeah. Well, look, where would we have been? You have the interesting thing of the enactment going back to 1787, when it took 9 states to approve the new Constitution. Now, that is illegal, because the Articles of Confederation said it must be unanimous, but they decided it was 9. Virginia and New York were still not in. The question is, what if Virginia had voted it down and it was a close one? You wouldn't have had George Washington as president. You wouldn't have had this country saved. We'd have been where Australia, Canada, South Africa, and India had been. You know, we'd have been somehow attached to the British Commonwealth.
Then you swing me. I changed my vote from Lincoln to Washington.
Oh, yeah, hey, there'd have been no Lincoln if there weren't a Washington. Yeah. Greg.
Well, I know we're splitting hairs here, but I'd like to hear who you believe is the most important.
Okay, and then we'll end it, okay. I believe George Washington did multiple things. He was a military figure. He was at the Constitutional Convention. He was a president. He saved the country. He had a period of service of more than 40 years. He was a man of action. Abraham Lincoln was a man of oratory. Until the late 1850s, he was just a spokesman. He really didn't do anything. So I come down on when I say the greater American, see, I expand it, not the greater president, but the greater American. I vote Washington. Thank you very much.
Before you go, I have one more question. I have a question. I'm not going to ask Morey. Do you think it's a great idea to have a maid who has such a good memory? You don't have to answer. Anyway, it was wonderful. Thank you, Morey, and I hope to see you all next week. Bye-bye.